Dan Conaway, as a defense attorney, is one of the cases that I recently covered was the Conrad Murray case, where the victim was a big part of the trial in that the prosecution deliberately worked Michael Jackson into every other sentence. In this case, that likely won't happen. Is that a good thing or a bad thing from a defense attorney's standpoint? I would think you don't want viewers or jurors thinking too much about the person that was murdered or killed.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, and you really don't, beyond evidence, the jury really should not be thinking about who the victim is, the personality of the victim, these kinds of things. These kinds are generally just not relevant. In this case,
because your client's on trial. It's his. This is because the
exactly.
client is on trial. The defendant. This is his time.
Exactly, and I think this case is coming down to that classic grave suspicion type jury charge, where you can't be convicted and the judge will read a type of charge like this upon a grave suspicion. You can't take a lot of circumstances and say, well, gee, you know, he really looks guilty, without evidence, and that's not evidence. And so I think this is that grave suspicion type of case where perhaps Mr. Peterson is the most unlucky individual in the world, as well are his wives or wife, meaning Ms. Salvo, but the bottom line is that where is the evidence? And so far we don't see any except some hearsay statements beyond the grave.
Yeah, you're going to want to, the prosecution will want to push towards the victims and would love to get Stacey Peterson involved. That probably won't happen too much, but the defense wants it all just focused, laser focused on the evidence, or in their opinion, lack of evidence. Let's take a listen as we try to figure out who Kathleen Savio really is to a little bit of sound talking about the victim in this case. Take a listen. Deep does it hit a juror in a case where there was alleged domestic violence or alleged marital strife? Because people do typically have in their history, especially if they're a little older, either personal history or they have a friend or a family member that has gone through a difficult relationship. Is that a chord that the prosecution, you think, is going to try to hit in this case because of the familiarity factor?
Absolutely. They really have to hit it, especially because you would want to hit it anyway. But in this particular situation, there's so little actual physical evidence, if any, beyond an expert's opinion as far as the new autopsy, the new examination of the body, that you've got a situation here where they really have to bring it in because they need to establish a type of pattern of conduct. On the flip side, there's a great argument that it's not relevant because these are prior bad acts allegedly done. The police were called out to the home. Perhaps there's a police report. Perhaps there's some additional information, but these don't go to, if I'm the defense, these things do not go to the heart of the trial, and that is whether or not Drew Peterson killed his wife by drowning her in a bathtub. These are alleged prior bad acts that the prosecution is using to smear the character of the defendant, in this case, Mr. Peterson. And so on the prosecution side, no, they're very relevant because they show a pattern of conduct leading up to the alleged murder. And so this will be hotly contested, hotly fought about. If I'm the defense, I'm objecting every single time they try to bring it up. If I'm the prosecution, I want to bring in every single phone call and act of alleged domestic violence concerning Mr. Peterson.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the prosecution's case coming up. The prosecution's case is heavily based on hearsay statements from Kathleen Savio. We'll have the incriminating evidence from her testimony coming up from the grave when we come back on In Session. Stay with us.
Yes. This is, I think, an excellent case for the defense because you have so many different lines of defense. You have the fact that there's no direct evidence. You have the fact that even if the jury can somehow reach the conclusion that Ms. Savio actually did drown and was killed, meaning that it was a murder, then you have the problem of, well, how do you prove that it was Mr. Peterson who did it? You have circumstantial evidence, but a lot of this stuff can really be explained away by the defense as far as this is what happens when people go through a heated and contested divorce. They say things happen, but balanced against that is the fact that you have no evidence. You have a person who has no history of this kind of thing in the past, and then you have all this innuendo sort of by the backyard fence kind of gossip, so to speak. And so you have a very, very sympathetic victim, and at the same time you have no evidence. And in that situation, you have a not guilty verdict, in my opinion. I will say that if I'm the defense, I'm really trying to get to a directed verdict because of the amount of publicity in this case, part of it generated by Mr. Peterson himself, and then at the same time you've got the very, very sympathetic victim factor in this case. And so you really do want to say to the judge at the end of the state's case, look, Judge, there's no way a jury should ever be able to deliberate on this case because it would be an absolute miscarriage of justice, because there's absolutely no evidence to support these charges brought by the state.
Let's say one of the things that the state does have, in your opinion, are the most damning for the defense.
I think the last one is the most damning because it actually shows conduct firsthand, where you've got a witness that actually saw Peterson doing something right after the fact. And so obviously that's the most damning one. These are golden for the prosecution. If Mr. Peterson is convicted, then they are going to be just massively appealed, because whether you bring these things or not is very hotly debated, obviously, on both sides, and a court of appeals would look at them all. At the same time, if you're the defense, first of all, your first argument is really, okay, so what? With the exception of perhaps the last one, so what? They're not reliable, arguably. Yeah, there's an indicia of reliability, but that's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It puts it maybe a 50-50 that they're reliable at best. And so what? You've got some statements made, you've got some hearsay coming in, things that you can't even cross-examine some of the people on them because the decedent is dead, speaking from the grave. And so they really lack any sort of hardcore evidence. And okay, fine, these statements are good, they're nice, so what? Where is the other evidence besides this other medical evaluation, which basically agrees that she drowned? So where's your evidence?
But Beth, these statements do provide the prosecution with a great story that I'm sure we'll hear in opening of how this guy progressed from aggressiveness to downright menacing. And then the prosecution's case, though, it's going to be interesting to see just how they use these statements throughout the next couple of weeks. Well, Beth Karas does pretty much everything. She talks to Randy Jackson on the phone. She talks Peterson with us here. Well, she also sat down for an in-depth conversation with